Okay, good morning, colleagues and friends. Last week I got a new job in a university in Middle England, and one of the questions that was asked of me was, what is the point of a professor in rural entrepreneurship working in a business school? And I thought, this is an interesting question. In the UK, 2% of GDP comes from agricultural activity, and 75% of agricultural land is in production. In Mexico, you've reduced down to something like 4% of gross domestic product, and you have 50% of agricultural land in production, I understand. This morning I had an absolutely wonderful breakfast, and I thought, without you people, we wouldn't have had the breakfast. Fruit, eggs, bacon, juice, everything else is down to you people. So I thought this notion of 4% is not a very good figure, because industries like the tourism industry, for example, would not survive without you, producers, growers, farmers, and people who are involved in agricultural production. So, right, we're up. So, what do I want to talk about then? And somebody's going to tell me that I'm doing this wrong. So, I've been asked to talk about a new rural paradigm. Bear with me a second. You're going to have to do it for me. So, if you take over. So what I want to talk about over the next half an hour or so is provide a context. I want to talk about some key issues which I think are important both at a global level and at a national level in Mexico and regionally. I want to talk about some key issues that I think are important for all of us who are involved in agriculture worldwide. I want to talk about this whole issue of what are our futures in agriculture. And I'd like to talk very briefly about the UK rural strategy and see how it translates to the Mexican rural strategy. So I'll finish off with implications in Mexico. Okay, can you put the next slide down? And down. So here's the problem for all of us. We all need to produce more and reduce our footprint, locally, regionally, and globally. And I don't think there's anybody in this room who would take exception to this statement. I think this is the reality that faces all of us. We need to produce more and reduce our footprint. So, that's the problem identification that faces all of us. Can you put the next slide down? So why? I think for four particular reasons, and I'll return to these issues throughout the talk. The first one is about, for all of us, securing the quality of our landscape, ensuring that we have biodiversity, protecting our environment, and having food security. That's the first one. The second issue is about reducing poverty and major inequalities, both globally and in Mexico, at a national level and at a regional level. But interesting, one of the tensions is that for many of you who are small producers with perhaps less than 100 hectares, The issue is about a harmonious development of the rural and the urban, and that I think is critical. And then finally, and the final issue on there, is about how we guarantee food security for all of us and for our children. So, a number of key issues. And I think the first one is, well, is there anything really new about sustainable agriculture? And I thought long and hard about this, and I thought we've been involved in sustainable agriculture for many years, but it is the nature of the production function which is changing. So in one sense, to talk about a new paradigm is a non sequitur. There are multiple paradigms. The second major issue, and you know this as well as I do, are about huge demographic changes and population settlements. And coupled with that is the notion of a diverse need of a changing population as we grow and expand. So here's a little figure. You can see this, and you can see the way in which the world population is projected to grow. And this is an issue for all of us. Phenomenal growth is projected, and we'll return to this theme in a moment. Now move down. By 2030, 18 years ahead, more than 60% of our population, 60%, will be living in cities with no involvement in growing crops or raising domestic animals. 60%. Huge figure. Already, the population of China has more people in urban environments than in rural environments. And this is starting to be replicated across all developing countries. And you can imagine what the implications are, and we'll touch upon these over the next half an hour. The population today is 6.8 billion, and by 2050, a third increase to a population of 9 billion people. So think about the logistics of feeding those people for all of us, and what are the implications for our society. Huge. But we don't think about it too much because it's in the future. But it's not really. It's here with us now, today. I'll move down. So the second set of key issues are threefold. As we have growing urban populations, not only do we have deprivation in urban environments, move down please, we have rural deprivation and inequality. Coupled with that is the whole issue of mobility inequality and our infrastructures, which are urban-centric. And there is less of an opportunity for people in rural environments to engage in a higher quality of life because of the infrastructural support at national government levels, which has been orchestrated and created to satisfy growing urban populations. So those of us who live in rural environments are starting to have further rural inequalities. I think that's a fact, and I'm sure that you've got examples of that. Simple things like food, transport issues at a local level, schools. How many schools are closing down in Mexico because of the notion of people being able to move outside to different environments for work and employment? So what we see is the gradual diminution of healthy and vibrant rural environments. And the third one is the whole issue of environmental issues. And there are three things there, I think. The first one is the whole prediction of food security and how we use our land productively. The second one is the issue of transport, which I've just mentioned, which is becoming increasingly problematic in rural environments. And the third one is the notion of energy. Energy is a major and significant issue for all of us, and you know that, don't you? So, let's just move on to the next slide. So what I'm saying is that it is a time for change. And all of us, even if we have 5 hectares in a very, very small farm, to those who have got 50,000 hectares, we can't afford to forget that we need to think about our longer-term perspectives for environmental sustainability and the quality of our lives, all of us. So, I think the first thing is that, as I've mentioned already, we need to increase our agricultural production to satisfy that growing urban population, which will increase to 9 billion by 2050. We need to increase our production, but at the same time, reducing our environmental footprint. And I think that's a key issue. Total arable land across the world is projected to increase by 69 million hectares by 2050, but that's only less than 5%. So we need to use it more wisely. This is one of the tensions. And third issue, we have to increase that productivity level of everything that we do, at the same time reducing waste. Increasing productivity, of course, has a knock-on effect in terms of food price structuring. And food price structuring, in the context of rising resource, is a significant issue for all of us. As smaller farmers become squeezed at the margins and more squeezed, the difficulties of continuing small-scale production will become very, very acute. And small farmers, for me, need our support because they add to the richness and variety of our environments. But you may disagree, you may have other perspectives, and I'll be interested to hear what they are. I was talking to a government minister just recently in the UK, and I was talking about the plight of small farmers. And he said to me, farming is an economic function only. And if small farmers go out of business, then so be it. Now, it's not a position I share at all, because I don't think that what we do is purely about an economic function. There are other wonderful things about living in rural communities, but are not just about economics. So, the second slide, please. Another time for change. 25% of land that's in production is environmentally degraded at the moment. Significant environmental degradation, and no more so than in Mexico. Right, this one. Right, thank you. So clearly, what we need to think about, and also I mentioned fishing stocks are overexploited, and that has a relative relationship with environmental production. We need to think about encouraging better economic practices, agronomic practices, creating the right commercial environment and regulatory environment for all of us who are in food production. And I mean very much that we should be focusing on not just large-scale producers, but in terms of small-scale producers as well, because of the social and political issues associated with small producers. But some of you may well disagree. So the other thing is, the other key issue, I think, is about also reduction of waste. So can I just very briefly talk about UK's rural strategy and see if there are any connections with the Mexican strategy? What we're starting to do in the UK is making a shift from subsidising declining sectors to investing in to develop the most productive activities. So that at a national level is what we're doing. And I think to a same extent that this is happening in Mexico as well, but perhaps not as strategically yet. I'm sure people in governmental areas will disagree with me. But clearly there is also the second point, which is about a focus on local specificities, the things that work well at local levels. and giving them that support. In order to give regions the opportunity to be sustainable, and I think this is critical and key. And what was interesting looking at all of the different regions in this room that are represented, all of which have got their different tasks and problems, opportunities and challenges. But all of them need to be supported to be able to develop those, to be sustainable at a local level. So what I'm suggesting then, that there is a shift from a sectoral to a territorial approach, that territories are becoming critically important rather than a simple sector basis. For example, milk production, crop production, pigs, whatever it happens to be. So the other thing that's happening in the UK is this fourth point, is that there's a decentralisation of policy right down to regional level. And this, I think, is key to develop our regional economies. I think the days of centralised planning, from my perspective, we've got to move away from, but recognising that we still have to have national economic viability. And the final one is this, my final point is about the increased use of public-private partnerships to encourage sustainable agriculture. So that's the UK's rural strategy. I'd be interested to see the extent to which it is mirrored in Mexico. If I can get over. Maybe not. This for Mexico. Many of you will be aware of the kind of things that are happening. Oops, sorry. I'm a technophobe. I can't hear you. Come and give me a hand, please, somebody. Back we go. How did that happen? You'll come across this issue. Increasingly, what's happening is that many countries are actually starting to buy land across South America. China, Taiwan, Americas, Saudi Arabia, who have got significant issues. And what they're doing is they're starting to buy land and take certain areas out of production. It's not happening in Mexico yet, is it? But it may well happen. And with it brings a whole range of issues. So in Mexico, rural regions account for something like 80% of land use, with 37 million people, but you know these figures. But there are problems. The first and most important problem is unsustainable farming practice, which is leading to land degradation. That's one of the most significant issues in Mexico. Poor drainage, low relief, low rainfall, variable climate. And these are the barriers. Sorry. I bloody hate these things. These are the barriers for you, and I won't talk about all of them, but for farmers in Mexico, the issues are access to distribution channels, significant. Farmers not being able to achieve economies of scale in terms of production and distribution, lack of inward investment by entrepreneurs, bureaucratic legislation and regulation which is preventing the entrepreneurial capacity and development of farmers. So people want to be enterprising, but there are certain structures which prevent farmers from being enterprising. And I'm going to talk about this as well, and I mentioned it when we talked about it last year, into the entrepreneurial skills of farmers. Farmers are not particularly well equipped in terms of management skills, marketing skills, enterprise skills, networking, opportunity recognition, all of those significant skills that you would expect business people to have. And traditionally, farmers have not had the necessity to do those things. So these are the kind of things that I'm sure that you've been talking about in a major context recently. So here's CONAGUA objectives, and I won't read them all, but the whole notion is that it's about the kind of things that I've just been talking about: reducing deterioration of ecosystems, making people more enterprising, developing opportunities for farmers to become more entrepreneurial, and deriving this lovely word, the harmonious development of rural areas. Now, you know if this is happening or not. I don't, but I suspect there are problems. So, challenges and the potential of Mexico's rural areas. One of the issues, as you well know, is that young people are not coming into farming. And that is something that we need to encourage. We need to actually provide mechanisms to encourage young people to recognise that farming is a viable economic activity which leads to the creation of sustainable rural communities. And they must be supported and given government support to be able to be encouraged to come into that long traditional practice. But with new skills, new business skills. And in one sense, Mexico has been a very important laboratory for many years for developing new farming practice. So it has a tradition of being innovative. But I think that innovation needs to be increased and upscaled in quite a big way. So I think that development of support for young people is significant. But I'm not suggesting that we ignore the average age. The average age of a Mexican farmer is something like 56, 57. Would that be about right? I'm not suggesting that we ignore those people either. That's my age, or nearly. So what are the pressures on farmers in Mexico? Just to rehearse this. Well, these are very simple. I'm not going to dwell on this for a long time because this is not my brief. But I think there is something like fivefold. They're not able to achieve economies of scale. They're not able to spread their fixed costs particularly well. They're not particularly well equipped in terms of plant, farm, machinery. And they're not able to meet the increasingly demanding market specifications for their products from supermarkets, for example. This is a significant issue, and I can give you lots of examples, as I'm sure you could, of anecdotal relationships that farmers have with major producers and supermarkets who control, in English, by the short and curlies, the farming opportunity. And something that needs to be redressed. And clearly, small farmers are more unable to resist economic pressures which are very, very variable because they can't achieve those economies of scale and variability. So, very quickly, there are developmental strategies, and I won't go through all of these, but and I'm sure that you'll be able to have a copy of the slides. But I think from my research, there are something like 9 particular strategies that farmers can engage in, which everything from changing their specialisation, cooperating with other farmers, opening external businesses through diversification into tourism, for example, expansion of non-agricultural employment. One farmer that I know, a friend of mine that I work with, has 5 businesses, all of which he does to enable him to carry on farming. And that's everything from renting his property out, using his land for horse production, tourism facilities and opportunities. He has a computer business, all for rural businesses, just so he can stay farming with 200 sheep. And that's it, because he loves what he does, and he doesn't want to leave the rural environment. as so many of our young people are having to do. They've been forced out in many ways. What a sad thing this is for our children. And of course, the last strategy, which is this one here, getting out of farming. But even getting out of farming is very, very difficult. Because once you're in, the